Spanish colonial administrators declared the Taíno people of Puerto Rico extinct by the end of the 1500s, wiped out within a single century of European contact. That declaration stood as accepted fact for nearly 500 years, printed in textbooks, repeated by historians, treated as one of the clearest and most tragic case closures in the history of the Americas. Modern genetics just proved the colonial record wrong. Today, the majority of Puerto Ricans carry direct, unbroken maternal descent from the very people an empire insisted had disappeared. The Taíno were the dominant indigenous civilization of the Greater Antilles when Columbus arrived in 1492, an organized society with its own political structure, agriculture, and language spread across what is now Puerto Rico, Cuba, Hispaniola, and Jamaica. Spanish colonization brought forced labor, introduced disease, and violent suppression of resistance, and within decades colonial administrators were writing the Taíno out of existence in official records, a bureaucratic erasure that later became historical consensus. For centuries afterward, Puerto Rican national identity was built on a two-root story, Spanish and African, with the Taíno relegated to a footnote about a people who simply hadn't survived contact. Puerto Rican families never fully accepted that story. Generations passed down specific claims of direct Taíno descent, oral traditions that mainstream historians dismissed as sentiment rather than evidence. Then, beginning in the late 1990s, geneticist Juan Martínez Cruzado ran the test nobody in power had bothered to run. His research found that 61% of Puerto Ricans carry Native American mitochondrial DNA, genetic material passed directly and exclusively from mother to child, tracing back specifically to Taíno and related Arawakan-speaking maternal lineages, 61%. Not a residual trace, not a rounding error in a broader European and African picture. A majority. That number alone should have ended the extinction narrative on its own, and for many Puerto Ricans and Caribbean historians, it effectively did. But genetics had one more move to make, because a majority maternal signal in a living population is powerful evidence, though it still leaves room for skeptics to argue about how directly that DNA connects to the actual historical Taíno rather than some broader, older indigenous American ancestry passing through the region long before Columbus arrived. Before we get to how genetics closed that last gap, it's worth sitting with how high the bar for proof actually was here. Colonial powers don't just conquer people. They write the official history afterward, and that history had 5 centuries to calcify into consensus. Overturning it required more than oral tradition and more than a majority mitochondrial signal. It required a direct line connecting the DNA of people alive today to the DNA of Taíno individuals who were alive before Columbus ever set foot in the Caribbean. In 2018, researchers publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences sequenced ancient DNA extracted from a tooth belonging to a Taíno woman who lived roughly 1,000 years ago. Her remains recovered on the Bahamian island of Eleuthera. They compared her genome directly against a sample of 104 present-day Puerto Ricans and found clear, direct genetic continuity, Native American ancestry components in the modern samples, tracing specifically back to this pre-Columbian population. 2 years later, a separate study published through Oxford went further still, recovering 45 complete ancient mitochondrial genomes from pre-contact archaeological sites across Puerto Rico itself, and comparing them against a database of more than 1,600 complete mitochondrial genomes sampled from populations across the entire Western Hemisphere. The result was unambiguous. The only exact, identical matches to these specific pre-contact Puerto Rican mitochondrial sequences anywhere in that massive hemisphere-wide database were found in Puerto Ricans living today. Here's a question worth sitting with, because it's the one that actually matters. If the genetic evidence for Taíno survival has been this available, this consistent, and now this directly confirmed by ancient DNA, why did it take until the 21st century for science to catch up to what Puerto Rican families had been saying the entire time? The answer sits in exactly whose record got written down and whose didn't. Colonial censuses and inheritance records tracked lineage almost entirely through Spanish surnames and paternal descent, the exact genetic thread least likely to carry Taíno ancestry, since colonial demographic patterns concentrated European contribution heavily on the paternal side, while indigenous ancestry persisted disproportionately through mothers. A record-keeping system built around fathers' names was never going to find a population that survived primarily through mothers' bloodlines. The extinction wasn't just declared, it was engineered into invisibility by choosing exactly which half of the family tree counted as official. If a system built to erase a population by tracking the wrong half of its ancestry is the kind of quiet historical sleight of hand that gets you fired up, say so in the comments. Because Puerto Rican Taíno descendants have been making this exact argument for decades and finally have the ancient DNA to back it completely. Tell us, if your own family passed down a story the official record refused to count, because that disconnect between memory and paperwork keeps turning out to be exactly where this channel finds its next case. What today's autosomal and Y chromosome data show, layered against the maternal picture, makes the full mechanism visible. Nuclear DNA studies place average indigenous ancestry across Puerto Rico closer to 12 to 15%, with European ancestry averaging around 68% and African ancestry around 20%, a genome shaped overwhelmingly by colonial-era power on the paternal side. But that autosomal average obscures exactly what the mitochondrial data reveals directly: an indigenous population that never actually disappeared, surviving instead through the maternal line in numbers. The official paternal-focused record was never built to detect. Genetic adaptations tied to that ancestry persisted too, including variants connected to digesting cassava, the starchy Taíno dietary staple still eaten across the island today, a biological inheritance running in parallel with the cultural and culinary one. It's worth being specific about what that 61% figure actually breaks down into, because the haplogroup data itself tells its own precise story. The dominant maternal lineage found across Puerto Rico is haplogroup A2, present in roughly 61% of the population and specifically associated with indigenous Caribbean ancestry, alongside smaller but still meaningful frequencies of haplogroups C1, B2, and D1, all tracing back through the same broad indigenous American maternal lineage system that reaches further south into the populations who first settled the Caribbean islands from the South American mainland thousands of years before. Columbus. These aren't vague genetic echoes requiring careful statistical interpretation to detect. They're specific, well-characterized haplogroups that population geneticists can identify with the same confidence they'd apply to any other well-studied lineage anywhere in the world. The science here isn't ambiguous. It's simply late. For the modern Taíno revival movement in Puerto Rico, active for more than 2 decades, before the ancient DNA confirmation arrived, this genetic evidence didn't create a new identity. It confirmed one that had been asserted, organized, and defended the entire time against a colonial record that insisted otherwise. Cultural practices, language fragments preserved in Puerto Rican Spanish, agricultural techniques, and specific family oral histories connecting individual lineages directly to Taíno ancestors, all treated for generations as folklore by outside academics, turned out to be tracking something the genome had been quietly confirming the entire time. Organizations representing Taíno descendants have used this genetic evidence to press for formal recognition in ways the oral tradition alone never managed to secure, from museum exhibitions correcting extinction-era language to renewed advocacy around federal recognition questions that carry real legal weight for a population the United States government has, at various points, treated according to the same colonial-era assumptions Spain first wrote into the record 5 centuries ago. The genetics didn't just settle an academic argument. It gave a living political movement a kind of evidence that oral history, however consistent and however long defended, had never been granted the institutional authority to provide on its own. The 2018 ancient DNA study did more than confirm a genetic link. It settled a scientific argument that had run for years about whether Caribbean indigenous populations before Columbus were even genetically related to each other across the different islands, or whether the region's indigenous history was more fragmented than anyone realized. By comparing the 1,000-year-old Bahamian genome against modern samples from Puerto Rico, Cuba, and other Caribbean populations, researchers confirmed a coherent, connected indigenous genetic history spanning the Greater Antilles. The same broad cultural and political network historical accounts describe the Taíno building before European contact. That detail matters because it means the survival story isn't isolated to Puerto Rico alone. The same maternal signal researchers found at 61% in Puerto Rico shows up, in varying but still substantial proportions, across Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and other islands the Taíno once occupied, a hemisphere-wide pattern of survival that colonial record keepers declared closed on every island at roughly the same time, and that modern genetics is now reopening on every island at roughly the same time too. There's a broader point worth stating plainly here, because it applies well beyond this one population. Extinction is a biological fact when it happens. It is not a bureaucratic decision, and colonial administrators 500 years ago had no actual authority to make it true simply by writing it down. What they had was the power to make their version of events the one that got taught, printed, and repeated for 5 centuries, until a discipline built specifically to test claims against physical evidence finally got the tools sophisticated enough to check the paperwork against the DNA. Puerto Rico's case shows exactly how large that gap between declared history and lived biology can grow, and exactly how long it can persist when the people being written out of existence have no formal mechanism to contest the record except memory, culture, and the quiet, patient fact of their own continued existence. What Puerto Rico proves, more decisively than almost any other population this channel has covered, is that an extinction declared on paper and an extinction that actually happened are not the same event. An empire wrote the Taíno out of the historical record because writing them out served the story that empire wanted to tell about its own conquest. The DNA never got the memo. It kept passing from mother to daughter for 500 years, waiting patiently through 5 centuries of official denial for the exact moment science finally had the tools to read what had been there, unbroken, the entire time. Puerto Rico's Taíno population was never lost. It was simply never looked for by anyone with the power to make the search official, until the descendants themselves forced the question and the genome answered it decisively.